Most of the videos I've done on this channel have just been little pieces of the website design, development, or optimization process, but now I want to try something a little bit different. So over the next 4 weeks, I'm going to be taking you through my entire process of building a website with GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks completely from scratch. In today's episode, I'm going to show you the design we're going to be working on. We're going to set up a fresh install with InstaWP, and we're going to take a deep dive into my starter site and my child theme to see all the tweaks and adjustments I've made to make my GeneratePress sites just that much better. In future episodes, we're going to tackle everything from site architecture to setting up ACF for custom fields and custom post types. We'll jump into GenerateBlocks to build out everything on the site, including using the global styles. We're going to use WS Form to create a front-end submission form, and we'll go through my entire checklist to get this site live and out to thousands of visitors. Although the site we're building in this use case is rather small, we're going to cover a whole lot of ground here, so you can take the lessons from this video series and apply it to any kind of site you want to build with GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks. If you want to make sure to catch all 4 episodes in this series, go ahead and hit subscribe now. And if you're ready to see what site we're going to be building, then stick around and let's get started. Before we dive in, here's a quick word from our series sponsor, InstaWP.
This is you. You go to the park to relax, to enjoy your time as a freelancer. Your freedom, right? But what ends up happening is that your client wants a website right away. So what do? You get your laptop out of your bag super fast, try to log in, try to get everything done ASAP. The client keeps texting you for updates, but you simply cannot log in into your WP admin. And you're spiraling, you don't know what to do anymore. But this could be you. You, freelancer B, chilling, enjoying your day as a freelancer in the park, and you receive a message from your client. You open your laptop and start building their website on InstaWP because you know that InstaWP will never fail you. And just like that, you have a website online. Now you can go for a stroll in the park, super relaxed, with a happy client under your belt.
What we're going to be building in this series is the Admin Bar's Black Friday deals page. Now, I've decided to do this on its own install rather than junk up the tab website, which also has some legacy things that makes it kind of a pain in the butt to add all this new section of the website to. Now, as you can see here, I've already done the design, and for the most part, it's fairly simple. It's kind of a card-based layout. Now, we'll have to theme everything to tabs dark mode colors. We'll have to set up the typography and anything else that we can control globally in the theme settings or in the customizer. And if I zoom out here, you'll see that we have 5 different listing types. We have a platinum, a gold, a silver, a bronze, and standard. Now these all follow a little bit of a different design pattern, so we're gonna have to think about how we're gonna create all these different cards. To do this, I think we're actually going to end up using a custom post type and custom fields. That way we can query each one of these different listings. We're going to want to set up global styles for as many elements as possible so we can control things globally. For example here, the gold listings, which you see here, and the silver listings here, they share almost identical design patterns other than the fact that this is a 2-column section and this is a 3-column section. That means we'll get to reuse a lot of this stuff inside of each one of those query loops, and that's going to be a good use case for setting up all these global styles so we can use classes to control that look and feel. Now, I don't have any mobile designs already mocked up, but I think with a design like this where everything's in cards, things are just going to stack pretty naturally. On tablet, we might still be able to get away with 2 columns here or here, and once we get down to a mobile version, I'm going to guess that all of this is going to stack into a single column, except for maybe these standard listings, which we might be able to do a 2-column grid for that. There are a couple things though that I don't have mocked up yet. We want to add some kind of section here at the bottom where people can submit their ads to this listing. So some of these ads are already going to be pre-sold, so those are already taken care of. But as this page goes live, people are still going to want to be able to add their company's listing to this page. So we need to set up some kind of system and a front-end submission form so they can submit their listings, and those will go into the back end of the website as a draft post. We also need to add a footer section at the bottom where I want to include some information about our sponsor, as well as all the privacy policy links and things like that. Like I said, this is a fairly simple layout to do, but I think it gives us enough flexibility here where we're going to get to tackle a lot of different aspects of developing a website. Obviously, all the theming stuff, like I said in the beginning, we're going to jump into the customizer and start setting all that up. Plus, we're going to get to take advantage of global styles. We're going to use query loops as we use custom post types and dynamic data through custom fields. And being able to set up a front-end submission form is going to make managing all this a whole lot easier since users will be generating the content and we don't have to do all that management ourselves. We just have to approve the draft. As far as the project requirements, here's what I think we're going to use for the tech stack. We're going to be using InstaWP to spin up our starter site and use that as our development environment. And once we go live, we're actually going to push this to InstaWP's managed hosting. We're going to use GeneratePress and GeneratePress Premium. Now, I will be using my custom child theme that comes with all my starter site settings. We're going to go through those one by one in this video so you can see all the tweaks and resets I apply into my starter site. We'll also use Generate Blocks and Generate Blocks Pro so we can take advantage of all the dynamic content settings. We'll need advanced custom fields to set up our custom post types and custom fields. Now, I'll probably use the Pro version, but I'm not sure that the Pro version is going to be 100% necessary to tackle everything we need in here. We could probably get away with the free one. We're going to use WS Form to set up our front-end submission form so it will automatically create draft listings when people submit their listing. Like I said, this is going to really cut down on the administration time since users will actually be filling out these posts themselves. And before we go live, I want to go ahead and set up perf matters to make sure the site is running as fast as possible. A huge shout out to InstaWP for providing the development environment and the hosting for this website. The first step we need to do is hop into their dashboard so we can spin up our fresh install. As you can see here inside the InstaWP dashboard, I don't have any staging sites set up yet, so we're going to go ahead and get that process underway. However, I have gone ahead and gone into the templates and added my starter site as one of the templates. My starter site is a collection of all the plugins and themes I use on just about every install, and it has a bunch of configuration done. The nice thing about the system inside of InstaWP is that we're able to spin up a brand new website using this starter site as a template. This means that once we click a couple buttons and have the website up and running, it already has everything we need to get started. So let's go ahead and do that process. We'll just go back here to our staging sites. So I'm going to go ahead and click create your first staging site. From here, we can start from scratch and set everything the way we want to. But for this use case, I'm going to use from template. So if we go into our template section here, I just have one template set up, which is our starter site. So I'll go ahead and click on that and then click next step. Now here we can set different versions of PHP, but I don't necessarily need to do that. And we could leave this site name blank and it will give us something random, but I'm just gonna go ahead and call this tab-bf for Black Friday. So we have a site name that we can recognize. After that, we'll go ahead and hit create site. And it's gonna take about 30 seconds to a minute to go ahead and spin up this brand new installation based off of our template. And just like that, our new website is completely ready. I don't even think that took 30 seconds to get completely installed and ready to go. So we have our WordPress setup already going. I'm just gonna go ahead and click this link here so we can open up the website and take a look at what we got. And this is just kind of the style guide page for my starter site, so we know that everything's imported over here correctly. We'll go ahead and go to the login page, and I'll go ahead and get us logged into this install. Now, before we get going on reviewing the starter site, I do want to jump back into InstaWP real quick and take a look at the listing for our new staging site. Now, by default, sites on InstaWP are set to expire after 30 days. This is actually really handy as I create lots of demos and do some testing. That way, the whole dashboard doesn't get filled up with junk demo sites. But in this case, I want to make sure that this site doesn't accidentally get deleted. So we can go ahead and reserve this site by clicking this little flag icon here and confirming that. That's just going to make sure that this site doesn't ever expire. So this will live inside my account until I delete it myself. Now we're going to get really deep into my starter site where I'm going to take you through all the CSS and PHP that's inside my child theme. But first, let's take a look at a few of the general settings. So of course, here inside the general settings, I've made sure to go ahead and set the time zone and my date format and time format preferences. That way this is always set up and ready to go for me. I don't have to remember that. I've also set up a style guide page. Now this bases a lot of things off of my child theme, and we're gonna go through that line by line in a second, but this just gives me an idea of the starting place I have for these websites. So for some really simple websites, I've kind of relied off of these defaults, and I could put together something that's fairly decent looking just off of these defaults. But of course, all of this is set up globally, so we can go in here and change all these things to customize it and match our design. But let's go through what's set up here in this style guide. So of course we have the typography. This is going to include all of our headlines and our body text, as well as list and block quotes and those kinds of things. I also have a default color palette that I have inside my child theme. It comes with a primary and a primary alt color, a contrast and a contrast alt color, and then a range of surface colors. Now, this will get me by on a lot of websites. In fact, I think on this Black Friday page, we're actually going to need less colors than this, but I often have to tweak this to really match the design. But for me, this is a good starting point. Next, we have our buttons. So for on a light background, I have the primary contrast, primary alt, primary outline, and primary ghost. We've also set up some defaults for a dark background. So we have primary on dark, primary alt on dark, primary outline on dark, and primary ghost on dark. So all these buttons are set up using global styles, so I can use these right away without having to do any setup. Now, most designs that I do, I'm going to use kind of this same pattern. So all I have to do is restyle these to match the different CSS values, and all these buttons are set up and ready to go. I also have things set up for sections and containers. So these sections here are just showing the padding on the top, bottom, left, and right. I actually use clamp values for these, but what we're seeing here is just kind of a reference of the desktop size. So here we can see that this just has one rim of padding above and below for an extra small section. But if we go down here to an extra large section, it has 10 rim on the top and the bottom, while this 1.5 rim, which is for the left and the right, that is consistent through all of these sections here. I also have some various container widths set up. So by default in my starter site, the default container width is set to 1280 pixels. That's in the customizer there. But there's also some use cases where I need a more skinny width. So I've set up variables for width M, width S, and width extra S. And I could see us actually using these as we set up the front end submission form, or maybe even the footer. My starter site also has a modal system installed. Now, this isn't part of GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks. This actually comes from a tutorial Jonathan Jernigan did using his modal. So this is set up so that when we click on this button, we get a little modal pop up here. It does have a few little quirks like that, just scrolled us back to the very top, but it does give us a modal functionality should we need it. And I was actually thinking we might do the front end submission form using this modal system just so we can see how it works. I've set up a default card inside my child theme. Now we're going to go ahead and build ours from scratch, but as you can see here, this card that I've designed and the cards that we have here in Figma are actually pretty similar. So we could use this as a starting point, but I think it might be better to see everything built out from scratch. Lastly, inside my starter site, I do have a footer set up. Building out footers is one of my least favorite things, so this doesn't work for every website, but at least I have something here as a starting point, and that definitely helps speed things up. Now I think we're going to be able to use my default stack to build out everything for this site, but let's take a look at the plugins that I include in my child theme. So I do use Postmark for all my transactional emails. One nice thing about Postmark is I've set this up with kind of a development email address, and I've connected that into my starter site. Whenever I use the template function inside InstaWP or clone my site in any way, it keeps that connection. So as soon as my starter site is active, that SMTP is already connected to Postmark and working just fine. Now, of course, I might need to go in there and change the email address everything is sending from, but at least I know if I need to do a password reset or anything like that, all the SMTP is already working. Now, it's rare that I ever build a website without advanced custom fields, so ACF Pro is always in my starter site. Of course, we have GenerateBlocks and GenerateBlocks Pro. I have the plugin for the Pro version or premium version of the GeneratePress theme. Perf matters, so we can do all of our performance optimization later. And we have WS Form Pro, which I use on all my sites for all of my forms. Now I know we're going to have to add the front end submission add-on for WS Form, but I guess we'll go back and install that plugin whenever we need it. Other than that, I think everything we need to build out this entire site is right here inside the plugins ready to go. 7 plugins now, we'll add an 8th later, and I think that will be enough to get us through this entire build. Now, one of the most powerful parts of GeneratePress Premium is the Elements feature, and I do have a lot of elements already set up in my starter site. So if we go here into the Elements, you can also get to this under Appearance and Elements. Now, you do have to have this activated inside your GeneratePress. So if I go under Appearance, GeneratePress, we have these different modules we can activate. Elements does need to be enabled for you to see this menu up here or over here. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about the elements that are already set up. So I'm always going to need a 404 page, and I like to customize those, so I've set up an element for that. An announcement bar is a little bar we can put across the top of the website if we're doing any kind of promotion or need to have any kind of notice. I always include this in my starter site because typically when clients come to you and they need to put up some kind of notice on the website, I don't want to have to fumble with getting all this set up. It doesn't have to be set to display. In fact, right now it's not set to display anywhere, but it's here should I ever need it. I have an archive loop built out. That's the card you saw on my style guide page. We have an author archive. We have the default page layout. All this does is set the width and disabling some of the elements. So here we can see we've set no sidebars on all of our pages. Under the disable elements, I've disabled the featured image and content title. This means that the featured image and the title of the page won't be displayed by the theme by default. We'll actually have to add that to the pages as we need them. Here in content, I've set this to full width. Since we're going to be designing with Generate Blocks, we want to have the full width of the canvas there. And then I've just set this to display on the entire site. There are times when I need to go exclude certain pages from it, but for the purposes of a starter site, I think this is just fine. Now, if we hop back into our elements here, the footer is what you saw there inside the starter site. I also have an element for headers in case I want to design my header out using Generate Blocks. The biggest drawback to that right now is the menu. Since there's no good menu block with Generate Blocks, there is the default WordPress core one, but I don't get along very well with that. So most of the time I'm not using this. HisModal.js is the JavaScript I have to enqueue in order to use the modal system. Now, when we get to doing that front-end submission form, if we use the modal, then we'll jump in here to this JS. I'll go ahead and add a link into the video description so you can go see Jonathan's video on how to get this all set up. We have a search results template and a no search results found template. Anytime the site is going to have a search button on it, I want to go ahead and have those search results pages set up. I've gone ahead and already set those to their proper locations. I don't think we're going to need a search on this page, but in case we do, all of these are already here baked into my starter site. All of these are pretty simple. You're going to see a shortcode here, which I'll go through once we get into my child theme, but I just have a search bar here. This shows the title of the search page and then a loop set up for all the search results. Finally, we have our single post blog template. We can go ahead and open that up and take a look at it. Here, I just have a pretty generic blog post set up. That way, the starter site just comes with something out of the box that looks good, and it's usually good enough for me to tweak unless I've done something really custom with the design. Like I said, a lot of these starter site things are just to have me some sensible defaults set up. So when I install a new site and want to get started on a build, I don't have to start completely from scratch. I've already connected some dynamic data and I've brought in some of the things you know you're going to have on a blog post, like the title and the author and a featured image. Lastly, in here, we have our single post for our policies. I do usually set up these policy pages slightly different with a more narrow width because I don't really want to design the full page out with entire sections and all that. I just kind of want to copy in my Termageddon code. So here I've just set up a element, in this case, a block element, that will work as the template for all my single post policies. Now, that might be a little bit confusing, but I do have a policies custom post type built into the starter site here. So anytime I need to add a new policy, I can just go into this area here, and here is my privacy policy. I could add terms of service and all those kinds of things right in here. I like to keep those separate from all my pages just so it doesn't get too messy. Before we jump into the child theme itself, I think it's a good idea to jump inside the customizer so you can see what kind of tweaks and settings I've already set inside of that. So in site identity, I don't think there's anything special inside there. In layout, I've gone ahead and set the container width, which we saw earlier is set to 1280. If I want to change that, you can see it down here in this default container. If I want to change that, I can go ahead and change that here inside the customizer. I also have this set up to 0 separating space and 0 content separator. These work really well if you're just using GeneratePress and not Generate Blocks to give you some default spacing, but since we're controlling everything with classes inside Generate Blocks, I really don't want this interfering, so I just zero those out. Same thing with content layout. I just have it set to 1 container. We're going to be controlling all of that with Generate Blocks, and the content padding, all of that is zeroed out as well on both desktop and mobile. In the header, I have the header width set to full and the inner header width set to contain. That just brings this header into my content width. Of course, we could change that to full and it would go all the way out to the side. Inside my primary navigation, I've set that mobile menu breakpoint. That's just the default GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks tablet breakpoint, because I want to go to a hamburger menu as soon as we get to tablet. So that's how you can set that there. If you didn't want yours to go until you got to mobile, you could change this to 768. And that would make it break at just the mobile breakpoint, but I kind of prefer the hamburger menu at the tablet version as well. The navigation location is set to float right. That will just make sure everything's pushed over to the right-hand side. The navigation dropdown, I really do prefer hover. We don't have any dropdowns here in this default menu, but I think for accessibility purposes, we'd want this set to click arrow. I don't think we're even going to have a navigation on this site, so it probably doesn't matter. I have checked the box for the enable navigation search modal. That's because I've set up some of the defaults here and customized this a little bit with CSS inside my child theme. But for most sites, I take this off and I don't think we'll need it in this case either. For the menu item width, these are just kind of defaults that work well for me. 20 pixels of width, 60 pixels of height. The submenu has 10 pixels of height and the submenu width is 200 pixels, although I think I do override that inside my child theme. I do prefer the off canvas panel. So that's set up here when we go to our mobile hamburger menu and we click that. This is the off canvas menu. It just kind of slides in from either side. I have mine set to right and I have the close button set to the outside. There are different options here. You don't have to have an off canvas panel, but that's kind of the mobile menu I prefer. Sidebars I've already turned off. The footer I'm doing with a GeneratePress element and using GenerateBlocks to build it out. And then the blog, again, we're controlling that with an element. Back here inside the colors, as you saw inside the starter site, I do bring in some default colors so we can see all of those here. We have our primary alt, and all of our surface colors. Now I have gone through and set up a lot of these defaults for the colors. We're going to be going through and retheming this site in the next episode of this. So I'm not going to go through and explain all these since we'll spend some time here, but I do go ahead and set a lot of this up as defaults inside of my starter site. As for the typography, it's kind of a mixed bag at this point. I still do have to come into this panel to add new fonts, but I'm actually controlling the size of all my fonts inside the child theme with CSS. It gives me a little bit more flexibility. This entire panel is kind of in a transition period right now. You used to have to do everything here, but now we're able to upload fonts locally through GeneratePress. So I usually handle that part there. Still, I prefer the CSS for the flexibility of using all the clamp functions. Again, we'll go through that here in a minute, but I don't have to spend a lot of time inside this typography panel. Under General, we're printing this CSS in an external file. The icon type is set to SVG, and my underline links are set to not on hover. So if there are any links here, I think I've overridden some of these. But if there are links inside of any of our text, they'll have an underline and then the underline will disappear when we hover on it. As for menus, I've just gone ahead and set up a primary menu, but it's not linking to any pages on the site. It's just linking to custom links. That's just to give me something to style whenever I'm starting a site, but I'll have to go through and rebuild a menu anytime I'm doing that. Like I said, on this design, I don't think we have a menu, so we're okay. I'm not using any widgets. Our homepage is just temporarily set to that style guide. We'll of course build out a homepage and repoint that here in a bit. And then we have some settings for WS form. I think all of these are still on the default. They're actually in the process of building out a new styler. So until they do that, I'm just gonna kind of leave those be, and we'll just style this forms as we need it inside of this install. As for the additional CSS, I usually only use this area for testing things out, and I've left a note for that here. I like to use this area when I'm testing CSS or writing CSS because I have the benefit of the live preview next to me. That way I could just see if I was just on the body and did a display of none, everything would go away. I get that live preview. When you're writing inside your child theme style.css file, you don't have the advantage of seeing the preview, but I don't like to leave all my finalized CSS in here. One, it's just a really small area. It's hard to organize things, but two, if a client ever gets in here, they're more likely to look inside this area and start fumbling with things. And usually I don't want them messing with CSS. So I like to hide that away inside the child theme. All right, we'll go ahead and publish any of those changes we made and hop out of the customizer here so we can start talking about the child theme. So if we go in here to appearance and themes, you can see that I have the GeneratePress theme already installed. And then I have my Ogle 2024 theme, which is just a child theme of GeneratePress. There was a day in WordPress where you almost had to use a child theme if you were going to do any kind of deep customizations to your website. But today, there are all kinds of snippet plugins that mean you don't really have to use a child theme if you're not comfortable with it. Personally, I like to be able to adjust the file structure and rebrand that theme to either match my company's brand or my customer's brand because I feel like it gives it that extra level of polish, so that's the route I'm going here. So let's go ahead and dive into the theme file editor so we can take a look at the different files I have set up. Inside my child theme, I have a style.css, I have a functions.php, and then I have some separate CSS for his modal, which is that modal we talked about earlier. I do try to keep this a little bit organized with this table of contents at the top, but honestly, it's gotten a little outdated and a bit messy, so things might not follow this perfectly. I tend to do a new child theme every year, and we're awaiting a pretty big update from GenerateBlocks that's going to change a lot of the way I have these things set up. So for now, I'm just going to leave it as it is, and I'll be doing a new child theme in the new year. So first, we start out with some theme tweaks. You could think of this as kind of like a CSS reset, but for the GeneratePress theme. There are some ways they do things that I like to do it a little bit different, so I can kind of set up these resets here. One of these things is a site wrapper. Now, we'll see how I've set the site wrapper up here in a second, but if I go to this website and we zoom out here, you can see there's actually a hard edge on the end of my website. I can't control what size or resolution monitor people are using, and when people have really, really wide websites, in fact, we can just go look at one of my websites here. We'll go to my agency website and zoom out here. You can actually see this hard edge here. If this wasn't set up to have a hard edge, this might be floating, or if it's positioned to the edge of the wrapper, it might be way over here all by itself. Obviously, this level of zoom is kind of exaggerated, but by giving the website a max width, I set mine at 1920 pixels, I know that nothing is ever going to escape that width. And for anybody that's using a higher resolution, they kind of get a contained website look, which I'm okay with. This also gives me a better insight to how big I need to save images. For instance, if I'm setting up a background image, I know it's never going to get wider than 1920 pixels, so I can save those out at the exact size. So to do that, what I've set up in here is a system that will wrap the entire site in a wrapper that I call Site Wrapper, and I've just set the width to 100%, the max width to 1920 pixels, set margin inline, which is left and right, to auto, which centers it, and then I've set the background color here to surface 10, which is kind of the background I want to set as the website. So although this is going to kind of override some things in the customizer that might seem a little bit more obvious, you'd have to go look for it here. This gives me some flexibility that I really like. I also am able to set the background color of the body, which is everything outside of that site wrapper, and all of that's controlled here inside the starter site as well. I've also set the main content area to have a minimum height of 65 VH. That way the content area is never so small that you can see underneath the footer. If you've not set this before, you might have really small pages where you can see below the footer, and that just kind of drives me nuts. Now I do have an override here that's a little bit more complicated. If I were just writing CSS and I had a section with an inner container that controlled the container width, I would actually have the padding set on that outer container, the outermost container. But by default, GeneratePress has actually decided to add that padding inside the inner container instead. And this has a few consequences to it, and I really prefer for that padding to be on the outside. Now, because I'm building everything out with GenerateBlocks, I can control that for the most part, but there are a few parts of the site where GeneratePress is still controlling that layout, so I need to go into the inner containers and set their padding to 0. So you can see one of those instances here is the inside header. There's a container inside your header that's where all the padding is controlled. So I've just set this to 0 pixels for the inline padding and set it to important so it doesn't get overridden somewhere else. Now, because I've taken this padding outside of the inner container, I need to add padding to the outer container. So again, I've just done this with a padding inline, and I've used a clamp value so it's 1.5 rem on desktop and just 1 rem at its smallest size. Again, I've used the important tag here so it doesn't get accidentally overwritten by anything else. And then there's a default site content wrapper that kind of wraps around everything, and I've just set that padding to 0. So this is a bit of a reset that might be a little bit harder to grasp, but if you're like me and would rather have that padding on the outside, this is a way you can go ahead and do that. Next are a few tweaks here to control the post editor width. This is one I've struggled with for a while. Every time WordPress updates, this seems to not work the same as it did before. But when I'm doing a blog post, since I have the whole website set to full width, if you remember back in my element, I've set that full width element to do the entire website. It will actually make the text of blog posts go all the way from the left of the screen to the right of the screen, which makes it hard to read. So I've tried to set that up with some styles that will only affect the back end to set that to a 728 pixel width. That way all my blog post content is right in the center of the screen. Now, as I mentioned before, I do go ahead and set up all the things for search to be enabled on the website by default. We're not going to use it on this site, but I do have some overrides here just on the style of the way everything in search looks. I don't really like the default search block inside of WordPress core, so I've just done a few things here to tweak the way all the search looks. You're welcome to pause this video and go through that, but essentially I'm just restyling this to make it look more like the default settings I would like to see. Now, if you remember inside my search results template, I had that little short code that brings in the search title. That does have a class on it. So I've gone ahead and styled everything here inside my starter site. This is just going to set the font size and all those kinds of things for that little search short code. Next, we have some tweaks to the hamburger menu. You'll see inside my theme functions.php, I've actually changed the default hamburger menu to one I like better, and I've had to set some resets here to make sure that we're styling that properly. Another thing that I'll do quite often is set up a button in my primary navigation menu. And the way I like to do that is to just add a normal menu item to my menu and then just give it the class of navcta. So I've gone in here and just set up all the CSS to make that match my contrast button. If you remember back to all the buttons inside my style guide, of course you can go in and tweak this if you need to, but this just gives me all the defaults if I want to add some kind of call to action button inside of my primary navigation menu. I've also done a small tweak here for any password protected pages. Again, this is kind of one of those things I'm having to set up since I set the whole site to be full width. I can't control the password protected pages and how that form shows up. So I'm just going in here and setting that post password form to be a max width of 76.8, so it's not stretching across the entire screen. In the next section here, we have some utilities I've set up. So one is a class for visually hiding something. So this is when I want something to not show up visually, but I still needed to get it read out by screen readers. So this is kind of an accessibility function here. I've set up some classes for line limits. Often when I have a blog card, I don't want to show a really long excerpt inside that card. So I can add the line limit 3 or line limit 2 classes, and that's going to actually limit that to 3 lines or 2 lines of text. I end up using this a whole lot inside of my site, so it's something that just made sense to add inside the starter site here, so I didn't have to set it up every time I was building a new site. Also, by default, all my text links will underline, so I've added a class called noUL that I can add to any element, and that will just turn the text decoration to none in case I have some kind of like sub-navigation menu or something that's set up as a link, and I don't want that to have an underline. I've also added classes for text wrap, so one for balance. This will just balance out headlines so you don't have uneven headlines, and one for text wrap pretty that I've set to paragraphs, divs, block quotes, and list items. This just means that we won't have orphans at the bottom of our text. I believe this still only works inside of Chrome-based browsers and not anything else, but this is a progressive enhancement that will give a better experience to people using those browsers, and anybody that doesn't have one of those browsers will just happen to see the orphan, but it's not going to break anything. Now, if you're still hanging on with me, buckle up because this might be one of the more confusing parts, especially if you're not super familiar with CSS and using variables, clamp functions, and all that. Essentially, I don't think the typography system inside the customizer is quite robust enough, so I've set up my own typography system here inside my child theme. Now what I've done is just put a bunch of variables at the top. This is kind of like the control panel, let's say. So I can go in here and set things like my headline font. This is where I would put the font family in, and the same for my body font. Those are usually the only 2 types of fonts I have. And then I've set up all the different sizes for these fonts. So essentially what I'm doing here is setting up a variable for my font size body. And then in here I have this clamp value. And I've done this for all my different headlines and some different styles of body text. All of this just gives me one little place where I can go in and control all of these things. So when I'm setting up a new site, this is really all I have to fiddle with inside the typography system. And down here below this, I'm just referencing all these variables. So you can see I have stuff set up here for my paragraph, including the font size, font weight, line height, margin bottom, and the font family. You can see the font size just references this FS body variable, which is set up here. And you'll see the font family is just referencing this body font, which is set right here. So essentially all I ever have to do is mess with these values up here, and everything else is doing the heavy lifting. Here I have the font weight, the margin bottom, and the font family set up for all of my different headings. And then I have some different values for line height and the font size for every different class and HTML element that has to do with font sizing. So you can see H1 through H6. And then we have some classes set up here for things like a pre-headline or my body XL, body large, or body small and extra small. Again, you'll see these are all just referencing these values that are higher up in that little control panel area. This isn't my favorite UI for controlling typography, but this gives me everything I need to be able to control this in some more modern CSS. I also have some things here like inside my single post. If something is an H2, an H3, H4, H5, or H6, I'm adding some extra top margin. This just means that inside of blog posts, any title inside of that, any headline inside of it will have some extra top margin to separate it from the paragraph above it. Here we have line height set up for any of my buttons. So if I just use this GB button, this will apply to any of my buttons. But if I want to override that with a global style, I can, but at least I've just kind of set that line height at 1em as a default. Another one that I just love here is removing the bottom margin on the last paragraph. So by default, paragraphs have some bottom margin. I've actually set that bottom margin up here in this typography setting. But anytime I have a last paragraph, I don't usually want that bottom margin, especially if it's in something like a card. It can make it look like there's uneven spacing around the card. So I've set this up by just saying if there's a GB container and the paragraph is the last child and last of type, this just basically explicitly says if it's the last paragraph inside a container, set that margin bottom to 0. Now this doesn't work inside of the editor because the editor actually injects some extra containers. So I've had to change this a little bit to make sure that I can actually preview that in the backend as well, which is what this line of CSS does. Next up, I have some of the defaults for the sections, which you saw inside the style guide. These are things like my section extra small, small, medium, default, large, and extra large. All of these have the same clamp value for the left and right, but they have a different clamp value for the top and bottom. This just gives me ability to have different section heights, essentially, ones that have more or less padding without having to reset that up every time. I built all of this before the global styles system inside of Generate Blocks, so it just sits here inside my child theme, but you could of course go in and use the UI to create all these classes. And last inside this styles sheet is just the variables for the container widths, which you saw those different widths. We have the default 1280, and then I have a medium that's set to 64 rem, a small that's set to 48 rem, and a extra small that's set to 40 rem. Okay, now let's jump into this theme functions.php file, and this is where I've done some PHP tweaks to the site as well. Again, I have a bit of a table of contents here, but I'm not sure that it still perfectly matches. So one, we have the editor styles. What I'm doing first here is enqueuing the child theme CSS into the editor. This just means that I can see all these changes that I'm doing inside this child theme CSS file on the back end of a page as I'm building it. Now, not every single style comes across perfectly, but for the most part, any of this child theme CSS will now show up in the editor. I have a similar function here that will enqueue all the CSS from the customizer into the backend so I can see that while I'm building as well. Now, for the third time, I think inside this child theme here, I have something set up to try to limit that post width, which I've set to 768 pixels. Again, I'm not sure which one of these is actually working. In fact, let's just go see if any of them are working at this point. If we go ahead and edit one of these blog posts, yes, we can see this width here is only 768 pixels, so it's not going all the way from the left to the right. But honestly, I couldn't tell you which one of these is working at this point because I've struggled with this so many times. If we scroll down here to section 2, we have content, taxonomies, and post types. I've added this little bit of PHP to just give us the ability to add categories to pages, since that doesn't work in WordPress by default. But sometimes I use taxonomies to control different layouts, which I've done a video on, so I'll make sure to link down in the description. But this just gives me the ability to add categories to pages. I also have one here to give me an excerpt to add to pages in case I want to use that excerpt functionality. Next, in section 3 are my UI and UX enhancements. Earlier, you saw some of the CSS for the hamburger icon menu. This is where I actually have to go and set this hamburger menu icon. You can actually see the SVG that I'm using here, which is just 2 bars instead of 3, but I like the look of it better. GeneratePress does have a tutorial on how to set this all up, so I'll make sure to include that down in the description as well. Next, we have section 4, which is roles and capabilities. In my starter site, I have a business owner role as a role type in the user. So, typically we have subscriber and editor and admin and all that. I've set up one called business owner, and this is what I give my clients by default. But instead of having to add a plugin to add a new user role, I've just baked all this here into my child theme. You can do Googling and find how to add these. There are generators that will do it for you. Next, in section 5 is branding and attribution. I've just done a few little tweaks to change some of the things inside WordPress to be more custom branded to Ogle. So custom footer text, this shows on the dashboard in the back end. I don't think we can see it on this screen, but at the bottom it will say website by Ogle Web Design and have a link to my website. Also, inside the source code of basically any website I've built, there's a line, a comment at the top of it that says built by Kyle Van Duzen at Ogle Web Design, a little wave emoji, and then looking for WordPress friends, join the admin bar. I don't know if any of you found the admin bar through searching through the source code of a website, but I do think it's a cool little Easter egg that's been hidden in there. Next is the comments management. I very rarely use WordPress comments, so I've just gone ahead and set everything up here inside this functions file to get rid of all the comments on the website. If I ever run into a site where I do want comments, I can just go and delete this section out and all that functionality is back. Section 7 is media management. The only thing I have in here at this point is disabling video uploads. I've just ran into too many clients that will upload a giant video file to their media library, and I don't want to deal with that on my server, so I've just disabled them from being able to upload videos. Section 8 is for any shortcodes that I develop. Inside of the starter site, all I have in here is that shortcode you saw earlier for my search results and no search results page. This just actually brings in a title that shows the search query as the title of that page. And that's not something that I can control by default inside GeneratePress, but I really like if we're using some kind of search page. The best way I could find to do that so far at least is just by adding a shortcode, although I don't really typically like to use shortcodes that much. Next, in section 9, we have some functions to override things in the block editor. So here I'm hiding all the default core block patterns. Core comes with all kinds of different block patterns. I typically will set up block patterns for my clients as well, and I really want them to use the ones that I've already built out that match their site and not get distracted by all the different core block patterns that are never going to look the way that they think they will once they import them into their theme. Next, under SEO and navigation, I'm removing all the attachment pages. So this is when you upload some kind of media, it can create an attachment page. I'm just getting rid of that. I'm also removing the date archive pages since I don't really want to have an archive page for the date things were posted. I could see where that might come in handy in some kind of big news site, but I don't think I've ever really needed those date archives before. I'm also removing the post formats. This used to be a thing that was fairly popular in WordPress. You don't see it used much anymore. In fact, I'm not even sure if it's in the editor. All my sites have it removed anyways, but this just gets rid of the support for post formats. Next, in section 11, we have dashboard and UI behavior. This is just on the WordPress dashboard. So if we just open this up here on this dashboard page, I'm just hiding all the default dashboard widgets that WordPress comes with. I really don't care to look at those on my screen. And there's another one here to hide any empty dashboard boxes so nothing gets left there that's just completely empty. Honestly, I'd rather this page just be completely blank. Now, WS Form does add one here that is handy for seeing any submissions. So sometimes I keep that, but sometimes I get rid of that as well. Next, we have the last login time. This is just a little thing I like to keep in my back pocket here. If I go inside users and open this up, we can see the last time every user has logged in. This has come in handy more times than I hoped it would, but sometimes people will say, hey, I've not been able to get in the site, or they tell me that they didn't make some kind of change to the website, and I can see right here the last time they logged in. I don't want to have to use that, but I am glad that it is here by default, just so I have it. So all this code here is just controlling, setting up that last login time functionality and adding it into that users page. In section 12, we're doing some tweaks to the login page. So I'll go ahead and copy this URL. We'll go into a private window and we'll go to the login page. You can see here, I've just made a few different tweaks to the way this container looks, just giving it a soft shadow, some border radiuses, a nicer border, added the logo, and then themed everything to match my Ogle Web Design brand. All of that is controlled here in this part of the functions.php file. So we have the function to change all this, and then it's just a whole bunch of CSS in here that I had to write in order to get this styled just the way that I wanted. Next is the template tags functionality, which comes from Taylor Drayson. I know you've seen me talk about this in a lot of different videos. This is something that's a default part of any install I do. I use these template tags on just about everything. So I keep this inside my functions.php file. This is a paid for snippet, so I don't want to show all of this on the screen, but I'll make sure to leave a link where you can go check this out for yourself. I would highly recommend purchasing it. It's a really good addition to the Generate block system. And the very last thing inside this functions.php file is the setup for the site wrapper. So if you remember when I was talking about on the front end and we zoom out, we can see this website has a hard stop at 1920 pixels. This is actually done here inside of my functions file. Basically, all I'm doing is adding a function to add a wrapper with the class site wrapper before the header, and then I'm closing it after the footer. This just basically wraps the entire website in a div that I can then control inside that style sheet. Okay, just one more file inside this child theme and we can wrap this up. This is just all the CSS that comes with the HIST modal system to be able to do the modal. Now again, I'll leave that link for how to set all this up down in the video description below. I've just copied and pasted all of the CSS that Jonathan shared in the video, and then I've just made some tweaks to make it more match my style and aesthetics for my starter site. So all of this is in here. Most of the time I don't have to touch it at all, but I do have it in a separate file here because if I'm not going to use a modal on a website, then I can just delete this file and not have the extra bloat. When I first outlined this video, I was actually afraid it was going to be too short and come in under 10 minutes, but it's obviously ballooned into quite the behemoth. And I think that's a testament to just how powerful having a starter site is. Just walking you through everything that's in my starter site took 40 minutes or so. Actually setting all that up from scratch will take hours. The fact that all of this is baked into my starter site, and when I want to start a new project, I click a couple buttons and poof, everything is done, is a huge advantage and time saver. If you don't already have a starter site with all your defaults baked in, I would highly encourage you to take the time and do so. It will really save you in the long run. Now in the next video, we're going to start theming out the website. So that means we'll have to jump into the customizer and start setting up a lot of the colors. We'll also have to dive back into the child theme so we can start setting up all the typography. We'll also set up our custom post type and custom fields, and we'll try to go ahead and build out that front end submission form with WS Forms. Now, if you learned something in this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up to let me know. And if you want to make sure to catch the next videos in this series, hit subscribe and we'll see you next week.